in a way, I suppose, I followed the line of least resistance. My dad was a typographer and a historian of typography. He didn't push me to follow in his footsteps. In fact, I think he rather tried to push me in a different direction, but I did, in the end, get interested in what he did. He wasn't a type designer so much as a book designer. He worked for the government printer for a long time, Her Majesty's Stationery Office. And as I say, I think his real job in life really was writing about the history of type. So when I left school, I got sent to the Enschede type foundry in the Netherlands to fill a year. I had already been accepted to go to Oxford University, but they couldn't take me straight away. I had to spend a year doing something else, and to sort of get me out of the house, my parents arranged for me to go and spend that intervening year at Enschede's in the Netherlands, a wonderful printer and type foundry who still made their own type. I mean, I left school in '55, so...
No, they made their own type. You're talking about metal type.
Absolutely, absolutely. No other kind at that date, really. So they still cut punches by hand and cast type in the time-honored way. One of the few places still to do it, I suppose, at that time. So I spent a fascinating year at Enschede's, most of the time in the type foundry, working with Paul Radish, who was the then soon to retire punch cutter who'd been there for a very long time. And I didn't, you know, it takes more than a year to become a punch cutter, but I acquired some skill, I suppose, sort of journeyman skill in the course of that year. But what I had really done by the end of it was learn an obsolete trade, because no one really was, apart from strange places like Enschede's, no one was really making type by hand, cutting punches and striking matrices and casting type by hand.
But when you think about it, did the experience of learning how to cut a punch help you later on in terms of working with text types and small types such as the Bell Centennial and understanding the optical adjustments necessary?
I think you're probably right. I mean, I think it did. Well, first of all, it got me very fascinated by the whole business. So when the year was up, I went back to England and decided I really didn't want to go back into academic life and study at Oxford. And to my surprise, my parents sort of agreed. I expected a fight, you know, but they agreed with me. So I then sort of started work, and because there was no work to speak of, I did a bit of punch cutting, but you know, I became I mean, having learnt to make type, I then sort of learnt to design it because there was no outlet, no commercial outlet for the making of it. I suppose it did influence me, you know, having got as far as I did with cutting punches by hand. I suppose it did influence the way I approach the design of type in completely different, I mean, now in digital form. And I've always been interested in how type was made. I mean, as I've lived through metal type and then mechanical type at linotype and then photocomposition, digital type and desktop type and web type, all these different technologies that have come to pass. I've always been interested in the technical aspect of it. Working with engineers has always been something that I've enjoyed. I had learnt to make type, as I said, at Enschede's by obsolete methods. I had then gone to work as an assistant for these excellent graphic designers in London. And I think I sort of developed a complex in a way because I wasn't sure whether I ever was going to be a designer, in the sense that I thought designers were sort of people who lived on a lofty plane, and when they wanted something done, they called in someone like me who actually did it. You know, I got my hands dirty, I drew the letters, and whatever it was. They existed on a higher plane, a sort of conceptual plane. And I think I began to feel that because I was very interested in the technicalities, how type was made and so on, that this was a sort of a bar to my ever being a designer. In fact, in some ways, it was probably a good thing that I was a designer, who did understand the technicalities of type, because plainly with photocomposition things were starting to change. We'd moved away from metal type, we'd lost a dimension. There were various aspects of photocomposition which it was quite important to understand from the technical point of view.
Understand the effect of light,
Indeed.
exposure.
Yes, yes.
What is
Yes.
it,
Yes, the optical path of the machine, how all of that worked and so on. Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to understand it in the sense that an engineer who designed it understand it. I just needed to understand the effects. So, and that was important at that time to do that. By the fall of 1965, most of the work of adapting the linotype metal library to film had been done. Not all of it, but the back had been broken of this huge task of adapting the metal library. So there was an opportunity for Mike to think about the possibility of doing some classes of type that had never existed in the metal library for technical reasons. And in these conversations that Mike and I had in London initially, before I even left to go to Brooklyn, rather centered on, what opportunities did the technology give us, things that we could undertake. So yeah, there were certain opportunities that photocomposition offered us that metal type, at least matrices, slug machine composition had not allowed us. But there were also some customer requests, and there were also some things that Mike and I just thought we would like to do. I mean, I mentioned Twen magazine, and there were other people in Europe who were very fond at that time of condensed sans serifs, Schmalfetter as they used in Twen. And I'd drawn some of these in London for Bob Gill and others. And I really liked them, and I suggested to Mike that we should do one, because there really wasn't one. And that's how what was called Helvetica Compressed came into being, just because we saw a market for it. One of the ideas that Mike had was that joining scripts, steeply slanted and joining scripts, had been completely impossible on the slug machine matrices. But was eminently possible in photocomposition. So one of the sort of jobs Mike gave me, indeed, as I say, before I actually left London, was to think about this. What would be a good typographic script? So I did what I always did, still do in a way. I went off to St. Bride's Library in London and took out books by and on the English writing masters of the late 17th, early 18th century. So I looked through that, and I found, of course, beautiful examples of English roundhand script. And one in particular that impressed me, by Charles Snell, who was one of these writing masters of the period, because in one of his books that was illustrated by Heel, he had done some sort of enlarged diagrams of letters with geometrical construction. I mean, how anyone was supposed to follow this with a quill pen, I cannot imagine. But for a type designer looking for a source for a script face, this seemed like too good to be true. I mean, it seemed like a gift. Linotype couldn't make joining scripts, but Foundry type had made them for a very long time, beautiful ones.
But with difficulty.
Well, they had to have kerning sorts and, various technical dodges to get them work well, but they had worked well. And they had a hairline to hairline butt joint, typically. Snell Roundhand had an overlapping joint, which gave me more flexibility. I once thought that I had invented that, but then somebody, it might have been you, reminded me that there was an Intertype photosetter script by Emil Klump that used the same, it wasn't anything like the same kind of script. Snell had this joining system which allowed me more flexibility in how the joints were made and so on. And in the end, I think, what Mike liked about Snell when I'd done enough of it for him to sort of see what I was aiming for, was that it was simple. These forms of Snell's were pretty diagrammatic and disciplined. When I was still at school, I got caught up in the italic handwriting revival and tried to do it rather lamely because, as I say, I didn't have good coordination. And I think it may have been that led me actually to draw letters, which I did already as a schoolboy. You know, I could draw the outlines and fill them in if I couldn't make the pen go where I wanted to, and so on. So I think the idea of drawing type may, in my case, owe itself to my frustrations with not being able to do calligraphy and so on. I think it is necessary to understand how the effect of tools on the way we write. I'm not a techno-determinist. I don't think that everything is attributed to the tool, but you know, you can't embark on designing Devanagari if you don't understand the way the pen is held and that sort of thing. I mean, the shapes make no sense unless you see that. The starting point of Charter was, again, a sort of technical one. At that time, it required a lot of memory, computer memory, to store outline fonts. I'm talking sort of early to mid-80s. And I found by analyzing existing fonts that a sans serif font, say Helvetica, only required about half as much digital storage as a serif font like Times Roman. Why? Because of all the curve points around the bracket, the serif brackets in Times. These were very sort of intensive in data terms. And I thought, well, since the engineers have a problem with handling all of this data for a digital font, obviously we have to have serif fonts. Maybe I could devise a font which did have serifs, but didn't require as much data to store it. And the most obvious way to do that is try to eliminate as many curves as you can from the outlines. So the idea behind Charter was that instead of having a curved bracket, it would have a bracket made up of straight line segments, a sort of chamfered serif bracket. And I did some trial characters, and I found that in storage terms, they were very efficient. They came out to something much like a sans serif type. And so I thought, well, this is really clever. You know, the engineers will love me for this. So I went to the head of engineering and said, you know, I think I have a solution to the data storage problem of serif typefaces. And he said, what problem? And I said, well, always. And he said, oh, you didn't need to worry about that. We fixed that. So they'd written some compaction algorithm or something or other that had reduced the amount of data by an order of magnitude or 2 or something or other. So here I was, not for the first time in my life, with a design solution to what I thought was a technical problem, but one that had gone away. A bit like video, you know, I did that in response to a certain technical problem, woke up next morning and found new machine, no problem. Same with the font size at that time. But then the curious thing happened, which is that these forms for Charter, I can't remember exactly how far I got with the design, but quite a way. I actually rather liked them. And so I looked at it again and thought, okay, so there's no technical requirement to do this. How about I just design it anyway, you know? So I did.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the Type Directors Club,